Lord, hold up a mirror to us. Give us what we need to see ourselves and one another in your light. Amen. Now, the scripture says David was ready with beautiful eyes. He was the Johnny Depp of his day. Both his power and his good looks worked a number on pretty much everyone. And in the first book of Kings in the Bible, you can read how he's remembered by history. David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, it said, and did not turn aside from anything that God commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Notice Bathsheba is not mentioned. Uriah the who? Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier in David's army. A mercenary, actually. The unlucky husband of the beautiful Bathsheba, whom David took as his own without asking him or her. It's one of the best told stories in the Bible. Thank you, Kay. And it begins so artfully. In the spring of the year when kings go out to war, David sent his general, Joab, with his officers and all Israel with him. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah Ammon, but David remained in Jerusalem. So what's David doing hanging around Jerusalem? Successful kings go to war in March or April every year. That's the ancient world. That's how they remain kings. I mean, look, that charming business I mentioned about him being a shepherd boy, may have a grain of truth in it. But really, David got to be a king the way most men got to be kings in the ancient world, by one, being very ambitious, two, by being willing to take huge personal risks, and three, by knowing how to exploit the weakness of the king before him. So David began as a warlord. Think of 12th century Japan. But his taste for battle was history by the time of our story this morning. And if you'd asked him, he would have said, more wars, been there, done that. I'm going to leave that to younger men. Frankly, he'd peaked. He had established the borders of his country brilliantly and sustainably. And now all that was left to do was to keep reminding people like the Ammonites, who lived on his eastern border, that he would not give an inch to them. And his generals could do that. And if you want to understand then what led to this morning's troubles, it's first and foremost David's successes. Alexander the Great, legend says, wept because he could find no more lands to conquer. Did he then go after women who were not his, like David did? Because, David's major kerfuffle is boredom. Bertrand Russell put it this way: unless a person has been taught what to do with success after getting it, the achievement of it must inevitably lead him to be a prey to boredom. And in his book, The Everlasting Man, another wise Brit, G.K. Chesterton, wrote maybe the wisest words about boredom ever penned. There comes an hour in the afternoon when the child is tired of pretending, when he is weary of being a robber or a cowboy, and it is then that he torments the cat. The effect of this staleness, says Chesterton, is the same everywhere. It is seen in all the drug-taking and dram-drinking and in every form of the tendency to increase the dose. Men and women seek stranger sins or more startling obscenities as stimulants to their jaded senses. They try to stab their nerves to life, as if it were with the knives of the priests of Baal. They are walking in their sleep and trying to wake themselves up with nightmares. David came up empty of purpose. And you see what he chooses to do in order to fulfill himself. Leo Tolstoy called boredom the desire for desires. Poor Bathsheba. She becomes the drug that David uses to treat his boredom. Powerful men often feel entitled. They find a Jeffrey Epstein, David did not work alone, and take what they want. It's an appalling reality, and nothing has changed about that. If we could only hear from Bathsheba, it would be instructive, right? But the only lines in the whole long story that come from her are these: I'm pregnant. Abused women are not only ill-used, they are silenced. Now, there's a famous painting by Rembrandt of Bathsheba holding the letter that informs her that her husband has died in war. And there's a wise look on her face because she knows what's happened. Bathsheba in that picture is, well, she's a Dutch woman, an attractive one. But if you want to know what Bathsheba really looked like, it was much more like this. The Afghan girl from many years ago. And that's not the end of the story. I mean, if it only were. There follows the cover-up, right? As Kay said, the plot thickens. There often is a cover-up, and it often leads to something worse than the original sin. David tries to settle his paternity suit in a clever, secret way by getting Uriah to come home from the war and sleep with his wife, right? He sends for his general, sits him down in his office, and feigning interest, asks how the action at the front is going. It's all very friendly. He even gets the man drunk. But look, even drunk, Uriah does not return home when he leaves the king. Instead, he makes his bed in the open air in front of the king's palace door so that everyone in Jerusalem can see that he refuses to take anything for himself that his men, exposed and in the line of fire, cannot have. You want an example of integrity in leadership? Are you hungry for that? I the hell am. You need look no further. Why David doesn't just acknowledge his responsibility and make the best of it for the sake of his child and Bathsheba and her husband, his talented, loyal general Uriah, is a mystery. In the morning, after Uriah had packed up his bedroll and eaten his simple breakfast, David wrote a letter to his commanding general, Joab, and sent it by the hand of Uriah himself. And in the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. I wouldn't read the Bible if I were you. Now, we should pause a moment, right? To take in the weight of the betrayal that is wrought here in the actions of a king, a man who believes he is above the law. There is something about total power without a constitution or knowledge of it, right? That hypnotizes the bearer of it. That leads an autocrat to believe that laws are written for other people and not for him. And you know, in our next week or two, we are likely to hear testimony about the January 6th insurrection from a 21st century Joab, who chose not to do the appalling thing that his president or king ordered him to do. I'm speaking of the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. If you haven't heard that name, you will. May turn out to be even more damning than the awful story we're reading this morning about David. General Milley may well be remembered as the one bulwark that kept us from losing this democracy. It's what kings do, right? Once again, the story does not end there, though David wished that it had. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him, When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And as one preacher, Barbara Brown Taylor, puts it, before the baby could make a fist, Nathan, David's personal prophet, was knocking at the palace door. He did not come storming in, hot as a firecracker. No, he decided to work slantwise. This is what happens after this morning's text. Nathan, the prophet, meant to get the king off balance, make the king into his own prosecutor. And it was a stroke of minor genius. And if you haven't read this story, I recommend you do. He could have condemned the king outright, you know. People, particularly self-righteous people who see life as black and white, do this all the time. They just blurt stuff out. But Nathan the prophet, a friend of the king, took no joy in bringing him down. He was after bigger fish. He wanted to change this king's life for his sake and for the sake of the kingdom. He wanted to retrieve the king's conscience that had gone down a deep, dark rat hole. And here was an opportunity to restore vigor and purpose to a leader who had begun to go to rot. Started out okay, but had gone to rot. It called for Nathan to make a cocktail of guile and restraint. And it would require a very light touch and a lot of imagination. So he told David a story. Now there was this rich man who had an abundance of flocks and herds, and there was this poor man who had next to nothing. Well, he had one little ewe lamb he'd brought up. He'd bought with money he'd earned by doing odd jobs for old ladies who couldn't pay him very much. I'm adding a little bit to the story. He brought it up himself. It grew up with his children. He called it Flossie. And he fed it with, his own hand. He even let it drink from his own cup. That's what we'll do at the barbecue today. And at night, it slept with him and his wife. It was like a daughter to him. And when David heard the part about how the rich man stole that sweet little lamb and cooked it for his friends, when he had hundreds of animals of his own to spare, David could not contain himself. And he pronounced a death sentence on that man for what he had done, stealing the one precious thing someone else who was poor had. And it was then that Nathan held up to the king a mirror and said, "You are the man. You are the man." And with those 4 words, David's sense of himself turned to ashes before Nathan's eyes. He felt, I'm sure, like his life was over. He was finished, but Nathan quickly let him know that a new chapter in his life had just begun. His purpose was not finished. He had miles to go and chapters to write and another child to father, years on with Uriah's wife, no less. And that child, Solomon, would rule Israel after him for 40 years. Is it not interesting what comes from the things we do in the dark? There would be consequences, of course. But David's death would not be one of them. Though I imagine he had wished in that moment, looking squarely in the eyes of Nathan, that a hole would have opened up under him and the earth would have swallowed him alive. God bless people who have conscience. Now, the child he had fathered would die like half of the children of his day. before the baby was old enough. Before the baby was old enough to make a fist, right? This is, in fact, the hardest part of the story for us, that a child would die for his father's sin. And I will tell you straight out that I have no idea how to even speak to that. But there are boundaries in this life, and trouble for those who wander past them, and for those who are connected to the ones who wander. It's simply the natural course of unnatural events and actions. Physical actions and moral actions both have consequences. We know this. Throw a rock into a lake and watch the ripples that come from it go in every direction. Conceive a child and try to pawn it off on another man, then make the child's mother a widow, and the child will suffer for that every time. Because we're all connected. That's why this happens. Relationships are joined in webs. Touch one part of the web, the whole thing vibrates, for good or bad, and everyone feels it. It's the price of the freedom that God has woven into the web of our lives. Barbara Brown Taylor has said that when we exercise our freedom in life-giving ways, even the trees clap their hands. And when we exercise it in death-dealing ways, the earth quakes beneath our feet. None of us is morally autonomous. And when we discover this as individuals, as a community, as a nation, God does not turn away from us. God sends various prophets like Nathan to wake us up, to tell us stories so we can remember who we are and whose we are. That's why I always include stories in these sermons, to hold up a mirror for us all to see ourselves. A woman named Martha Beck has a blog called You Spot It, You Got It. And the idea is this: if you spot a weakness in someone else's character, it may very well be because you have it yourself, though you may be unable to see it there. Here's how she put it. My friend is lazy, willful, and self-absorbed. Wait, could that actually be me I'm talking about, who is lazy, willful, and self-absorbed? We're talking here about projection, right? Michael Caine, remember Michael Caine? He plays a wonderful hypocrite in the epically low comedy film Goldmember. At one point he says, there are two kinds of people I cannot stand. Those who are intolerant of other cultures and the Dutch. What you dislike most in me may actually be what you most dislike in yourself. Which makes me wonder what shadow or wound lay deep inside Nathan, the prophet who told the story. What shadow or wound in him allowed him to see what was deep hidden in his king? Consider that. When, I wonder, had someone said to Nathan the words, "You are the man"? A lot of times when we mess up in life, we tend to think we're the only one who ever did such a thing. And if we go on beating ourselves up for the rest of our lives, well, that's a huge mistake. Doing that's no better than whatever we did to make us ashamed of ourselves in the first place. But if we can realize that, like everyone else, we are only human, that can make a huge difference. And I imagine that when David heard those words from Nathan, it was like being split in two. But the moment we find out how culpable we are can be a gift. with that revelation comes an opportunity for us to accept ourselves, flawed though we are. So, was David a good man or a bad man? Silly question. He was both. Life is complicated. You and I are complicated. Like David, we too rationalize our choices and actions to ourselves. We do this all the time. But from time to time in life, if we are paying attention, we all hear the words, "You are the man." Maybe we're watching a movie, and boom, we see ourselves, if only for a moment, in a character that is just as human as we are, just as flawed. We identify with him or her, and it's a little bit painful, or it's very painful, but in the end, if we have presence of mind and enough sense of self, it's a good thing. Because maturing in life is all about coming to realize we can accept such truths about ourselves, and we can, in fact, survive those moments of truth-telling and go on. We may find we don't even need a Nathan. We can recognize our own hypocrisy, right? We can say those words, "I am the man. I am the woman," when we need to. Thank God for that.